Welcome to our study today in the book of Genesis. We are in Genesis 13. Genesis 13 deals with separation, and in these verses we see Abram's separation from the world in the first four verses, and then in verses 5 through 13 we are in the process of seeing Abram's separation from Lot, and of course by extension from that we see Lot's failure to separate and the dangers and that brought with that. So with that in mind, we have been looking at Abram's separation from Lot, Egypt being a picture of the world in the first four verses, and now Lot is actually a picture of a disobedient believer. And we saw in verses 5 through 9 how the wealth of Abram and Lot brought strife between Abram and Lot, and we saw why Abram says we should separate. And there were a couple of reasons for that we looked at in our last day's study. So today I want to look at verses 10 through 13 and comment on those verses today. It says there, and Lot lifted up his eyes. This is Genesis 13:10. Lot lifted up his eyes, and behold, all the plain of Jordan, and it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. I encourage you, I double underline that phrase in my Bible, like the land of Egypt. We'll see the significance of that in a moment, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So as we come into these verses, we have seen already how the wealth brought a strife between Abram and Lot, and now we're going to notice how wealth in the life of Lot brings greed. You see, the truth of the matter is, Lot should have offered Abram first choice in this matter, and there's a couple of reasons for that Lot should have given Abram first choice, but Lot was so selfish here. You see, Abram gave him first choice, and Lot takes it. And in doing so, he did not show to Abram any respect. Keep in mind, Abram is the elder here in this passage and should have been given the first choice by Lot because of the fact that he was the elder. And not only did Abram not show respect, but he also did not show gratitude. Abram had cared for orphan Lot after his parents had died, and Abram had helped him get started in business, and Lot should have, out of gratitude to Abram, given Abram first choice. But as we come into this passage, Lot is only looking out for himself, and he really didn't care how Uncle Abram fared, and selfishness always has built into it materialism, the desire for more. And that's exactly what we see here in the life of Lot. Lot lusted after the wealth and the beauty. Notice in verse 10, it says, Lot lifted up his eyes, and behold, all the plain of Jordan, and it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as a garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. So as Abram looked around and he saw the green pastures and the nice thick grass and the beautiful streams and all that, he lusted after that which he saw. Let me just remind you of a couple of verses that talk about the dangers of this. In James chapter 1, and in verses 14 and 15, we find this truth. It says, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. You know, many times we like to blame our sin on our family members, or blame it on the devil, or blame it on the world, but the truth of the matter is, we make our own choices. It's our own fleshly nature. It is our lust that leads us towards sin. In 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17, it says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passes away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. I was also reminded about the warning about wealth in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And in verses 5 through 11, it says this, perverse disputings of men of corrupt minds and destitute of the truth, supposing that gain is godliness. You see, there's a warning, friend, right there against the prosperity gospel. Supposing that gain is godliness, from such withdraw thyself. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us therewith be content. And they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and to many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in perdition, or destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some have coveted after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. But thou, O man of God, flee these things, and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and meekness. So the Bible reminds us of the danger of lusting after wealth or lusting after beauty. And Lot here is really condemned in his choosing, because the chief guide that Lot used was his material prosperity. The condemnation of Lot is that material advantage was all that guided him in life. He never sought the Lord's counsel. He never considered anything else. He was not concerned about spiritual or moral perils, as we see in Sodom and Gomorrah. Friends, it was not food for the soul that guided his choice, but rather food for his sheep and his cattle. It was not fellowship with the saints of God that guided his choice, but rather fortune in his pocket. The guide that Lot used to make his choice is, unfortunately and sadly, the guide that most people still use today in making important choices. They don't choose where they can best fellowship with the saints, but rather they want food for they want material things and fleshly things to guide them. And we don't consider fellowship with the saints, but what we consider merely is fortune in the pocket. And people will move simply because of a job or things like nature, not taking into account their walk with God and the walk with God of their family. And it's no wonder that so many people are living shipwrecked lives today in the society that we live in. Lot had not forgotten Egypt. Notice what it says in Genesis 13. It says in the middle of the end of verse 10, that it was like the land of Egypt. Lot had come out of Egypt, but sadly, Egypt had not come out of Lot. Egypt was still in Lot. And this area he looked at was well watered and all of that, but all of that changed with the destruction of Sodom. And Lot makes the wrong choice in verse 11. It says, Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Lot made a wrong choice, and this, as a result of that, it led him into backsliding. Lot pitches his tent toward Sodom in verse 12. It says, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. He did not move into Sodom at the first, but later on he did. We see in Genesis 14:12, it says, And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. You see, compromise happens a little at a time. When we fail to separate, like Lot, we can pitch our tent toward Sodom, but before long we will be living in Sodom. And then notice God's evaluation of Sodom in verse 12. Or verse 13, rather, I should say. It says, But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. And I was reminded, as I thought about that, of the verse in 2 Peter chapter 2 that says this. 2 Peter 2 and verse 20. It says, For if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled therein and overcome, the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. And you know, the sad thing is, Christians have not learned from the life of Lot. They've not learned from the compromise of Lot and the failure to separate, and many are making the exact same kind of mistake today. In verse 13, we see that Lot thought that he was getting the best apple on the tree, but friends, he found out that it was full of worms. And all of Satan's apples, no matter how good he makes them look, friends, are full of worms. Lot, in the end, is going to lose everything that he gains by his choice when God destroys Sodom. Friends, when you ignore moral and spiritual values and only look at material values, when making your choice, you will end up losing materially, morally, and spiritually. And that is a lesson that we ought to take from this passage. Tomorrow, we're going to look at what Abraham's choice resulted in for him. Have a great day.